Music.
I think that music's for you, Jean-François, huh?
I hope not. First of all, let me say I was very impressed that a number of my friends in the venture industry were wearing ties on the previous panel. It makes me feel a little
You didn't get the memo.
No, I didn't get the memo. Yeah. I feel a little bit inappropriate. So don't forget about the question. I'll try to read, even so we've got pretty strong lights in your eyes. So we're very fortunate to have Bob Bradway here, CEO of Amgen. Bob, so Amgen and Genentech, to be fair, are two special companies in our industry.
Thank you.
The company is going to be, if I'm not mistaken, 40 years old next year. Founded in 1980. IPO in 1983, so I was quick, I was doing some research. I mean, I kind of remember that, but I was surprised. And then, of course, EPO approved in 1989, about 30 years ago. The company has seen tremendous growth. I was looking at your financial and almost $24 billion in revenue last year. And even more interestingly, almost $20 billion invested in R&D in the past 5 years. So let's start with Amgen and where you are today, and where do you see going in the future?
Well, thank you for that summary. Yeah, we have an exciting past, but we're even more excited about what we see in the future. And just as was the case on the day that we had our first medicine approved, and by the way, we had a medicine approved a few minutes ago.
Yes, congratulations.
Another innovative therapy, this for osteoporosis, a drug called Evenity. So we're delighted to add to the innovation that we've already brought to that field in the form of our prior drug Prolia, a new drug which helps to build bone for people who are at risk of fracture. But just as was the case when Epogen was first approved, we as a company are focused on innovative medicines for patients that are suffering from serious disease. We're very active in 6 areas today, and we continue to try to push the boundaries of biotechnology and hope we can do it for the next 40 years.
So do you think that $20 billion is going to be the benchmark for the next 5 years? Or?
Well, I think there are a lot of people in our industry spending much more than what we have over the last 5 years. Our responsibility is to earn a return on that $20 billion. One of the ways we hope to do that is through our focus on genetics. And we acquired a company called Decode Genetics, which JF is very familiar with, as he was one of the founding investors. And that acquisition made us the world leader in human genetics. And now today, something like 3/4 of our pipeline of molecules is genetically validated or inspired by the insights that we get from doing human genetic analysis. So we're excited about trying to tilt the odds in our favor on that $20 billion that you refer to. But the hurdle's high, and we're really excited about what we see at the moment in cancer, excited about cardiovascular disease, excited about some new avenues in autoimmune disease. Again, the future looks bright, but there are some big questions which I think we ought to try and get to at some point in our discussion around the model and the reimbursement and the pricing environment here in the U.S.
So before we go about some of those broader issues for the industries that obviously are very important and actually becoming very pressing, since we are into an AI meeting, I thought I would start by bugging you on AI and tell us how you guys look at that at Amgen.
Yeah, well, I think we're at the early innings of how AI might be applied at a company like Amgen, and my colleague Mike Nohaley, I think, represented well where we are in the prior panel. But we're at a stage now where we're seeking to deploy it in a variety of different areas in the business. We happen to have medicines, including the osteoporosis medicines that I just referred to, and our cardiovascular medicines, in particular Repatha, which profoundly lowers LDL cholesterol. So we have medicines that we think lend themselves to an environment where we can predict and prevent, as opposed to waiting to fix that which is broken. So we're using AI and machine learning to try and help us identify patients who are at risk of fracture, so that we can try to get those patients on a therapy like Prolia, and hopefully over time on a therapy like Evenity as well, to prevent either the next fracture or the first fracture in the case of women who are at risk of that due to advanced osteoporosis. So I think that's an example where machine learning can be very, very effective through review of radiologic images, alerting physicians, patients, payers to the risk that exists in patient populations that might otherwise be ignored. And as the World Health Organization reminds us, osteoporosis is a global epidemic. And we have far too many women in this country fracturing because their skeletons aren't protected after the point where they've reached frank osteoporosis. So having machine learning to help identify those patients and flag for the system people who might benefit from therapy, I think is a good example of where machine learning is already helpful today. We're also using that same approach to machine learning to try to identify, again, patients that are at risk of heart attack and stroke. And as some of you in the audience know, for some patients it's not that difficult. You know, for some patients we hardly need machine learning to identify who's at risk of a major event. Nonetheless, there are still tens of millions of patients in the United States who are at risk, are probably not being appropriately treated. And so we're hopeful that machine learning can help on that. You know, I think there's a lot of interest in the press and maybe even in the audience about the question of whether we can use it to transform our understanding of genetics and disease, or whether we can become that much more effective at new molecular entity design by using the tools of machine learning. You know, to me as a resource allocator, it still feels a little bit early for that. We might get there one day, and we clearly are doing some things in genetics, for example, that you know, are advanced data analytics. But you know, I think right now the AI is probably going to be deployed first in other areas of the business. You know, rational allocation of rep resources, transformation of some of our back office activities, compliance activities, and so forth.
Yeah, so we see the same thing in our sector where a lot of people asking us, and the previous panel was informative, you know, is AI going to transform R&D and discovery research? I think we see some emerging benefit, but it hasn't been transformative yet. To go back on the application of AI on healthcare data for registered drugs and how you can optimize care and optimize the utilization of your current product. How did you look at the Flatiron Roche deal and, you know, the focus on real-world evidence? I mean, I think that the Flatiron itself was not an AI company. I think they provided large data set, but my understanding is that Roche is pretty aggressive in trying to mine that. Do you see that as a general direction and something that you guys noticed?
We have invested, yes. I think it's an interesting question. We have invested heavily in real-world evidence, and we think that real-world evidence will be useful to us, both in trying to, again, predict who's at risk so that we can help prevent downstream diseases, but also to target more effectively our clinical development programs. And so I think, you know, with Flatiron, it's always a question, do you need to own the cow to drink the milk? And, you know, I think we and others are still able to drink the milk there from Flatiron without having to own the cow. Yeah. But you know, clearly real-world evidence is of increasing use, not just in cancer, but across the disease areas.
I guess I take it that it was an expensive cow.
No comment.
Yeah. All right. And so since we're talking about AI, how about digital medicine, just to touch on that? And there is some connection with the previous panel, but have you guys been...
We're a little bit. You know, again, I think you got a sense of this from the previous panel. We're not directly investing a great deal in digital medicine. There are some applications which are of interest to us. We're doing some work in migraine, for example, where we're using things like the watches to help us understand the behavior of migraine patients in the period before and after an event, and then try to understand how our recently approved medicine for migraine, Aimovig, might benefit those patients. And there are other examples like that. I think the AFib study from Apple is interesting, and I think we'll continue to see applications like that. But here too, I would say early days.
So let's move to some of those bigger issues that you were hinting at. The first one that you and I had discussed when we were thinking about, you know, some of the theme is the price transparency, and then of course the interesting HHS initiative. What was very interesting to me and actually gratifying in some ways is that there are a number of parties that have been pushing for so-called price transparency, where for some reason the pharma industry was the only subject of the transparency. It looks like both pharma and biotech has done a decent job of starting to expand the scope of the transparency initiative beyond just pharma, and putting actually some of the PBM and payers in the same light. It looks like HSS has listened and is going in a similar direction. Where do you think that initiative may go, and what might be the impact?
Well, I think we need transparency across the healthcare system. And as you say, I think you used the word only. I might insert the word first instead and say that we're the first of the major sectors to be exposed to the questions about, actually, maybe we're not even the first. The hospitals, I think, inherited a responsibility, pricing transparency responsibility in January. So I think we're going to see this work its way across the healthcare system. And I think it's time for that, frankly. You know, I think we should have a discussion about the price of medicines, but we need to have it in the context of the price of healthcare, and we need to have it in the context of who is making what on medicines in the value chain. You know, I think it would come as a surprise to many, including on Capitol Hill, to understand that it's not unusual for people in the healthcare value chain to be marking up several-fold the cost of the drugs they acquire from us. And I think that's the kind of discussion that we need to have transparently, because I think it's obvious that some kind of major restructuring of the U.S. healthcare system is required, and I think the first step of that is transparency.
Do you think it's too early to know what shape that initiative is going to take, and what might be the impact on the gross to net, or at least how we're thinking about it today?
I think it's still early, but I think on the question of gross to net, your question relates in large part to the rebate rule that the Secretary of HHS, who was here earlier in the conference, has advanced. And we're encouraged by the initiative that the Secretary and his team have taken to try and roll back the rebate process. I think the time has come for that. I don't think that serves the interests in particular of our sickest patients. And I think right now our sickest patients are paying disproportionately for their medicines, and therefore are in effect subsidizing the healthy in the population. And I don't think that's what was ever intended. So I think focusing on the rebate rule is an appropriate first step, and we as an industry and we as a company are advocating for policy changes like that, which improve transparency and try to make medicines more accessible and available, affordable to the people who need them. You know, as you know, JF, there's nothing more frustrating than developing a medicine that can help prevent somebody from having a heart attack or stroke, and then finding that the individual can't afford it for whatever reason. And if that's because of the price of the medicine, that's a discussion we should have. But if it's because of some problems in the intermediary process, again, we need to shine a light on that. So we're encouraged. I think the step that the administration took last week to provide some coverage or protection for the insurance plans as they think about bidding for 2020 in Part D will help, so that we may actually see an important first step being taken here in this process as a result of the initiatives of Secretary Azar and the President.
So it's a good segue, and I wanted to touch on that, and I know it's probably been a frustrating topic for you, but the PCSK9, I think, is a really interesting story where, I think it's a great science first and then development story. You guys obviously did a great job. And then, the product, I wouldn't say initially hit a brick wall, but it was very clear that a number of players in the marketplace introduced lots of friction to basically control access. So, don't want to put you on the spot, but it'd be good to hear a little bit how you guys looked at that and how you've been trying to navigate. And
well, let me just quickly give you a little bit of background on the medicine that JF's talking about, which he referred to PCSK9, and inspired by some human genetics that pointed to that being important for cardiovascular disease. We developed an antibody that lowers levels of PCSK9 in the body, and as a result of that, profoundly lowers LDL. So we can lower LDL cholesterol, for example, as we've shown in our clinical studies, by 60+% effectively in all comers. So with statins or without statins, with ezetimibe, without. So we profoundly lower LDL, and then in a large outcome study demonstrated that along with that, we were able to reduce the risk of stroke, heart attack, and other interventions. So it has the potential to make a big difference in what is the most significant disease that we face as society today, which is heart disease. We spend as a country $600+ billion a year on heart disease. I saw Nancy Brown from the AHA in the audience earlier, the CEO of the AHA, and those are her numbers, $600 billion plus as a society fighting heart disease. And one of the big reasons is LDL levels are too high. Now, we launched the product, as JF said, and last year lowered the price by 60%. And despite having lowered the price by 60%, many patients are still directed to the higher priced list products. So we have both available on the market, and one would have thought that payers would have directed patients to the lower priced version of the products, but that's not happening. In fact, it's still the minority of patients who are getting the lower priced products. So I think that shines a light on a problem that we need to openly talk about, which is what are the incentives in the system that are leading patients to go to the more expensive product when they can get the same thing at 60% less, and with the direct result that their out-of-pocket copay is 60% less if they start with that product. So something's not right in the system, and perhaps not surprisingly, that came up a couple times today in the hearings in Washington, D.C. on drug pricing.
So it's actually a very good segue for a biosimilar, right? I mean, in some ways, going back a few years and starting with some of the launches in Europe, and even in Europe, the uptake was much slower than what people anticipated, and so there are a number of issues here to potentially discuss around biosimilar. One is, to what extent is it going to be relevant in the U.S. market? I mean, one would assume it will be, but again, it's been kind of a slow start. Substitution, which is again interesting, the wrong incentive, and I think you already touched on it, where in some ways, even if you have equivalent data, you see a lot of patients being directed to the more expensive product, which might be a good or a bad thing depending on where you stand. But I mean, it really points to some market inefficiency. And then, of course, furthermore, there is a looming concern that we've seen in generics, which is if you end up in a marketplace that is a little bit distorted and you start having some supply chain issue, then we're going to get back into some excessive pricing and some of the issues that Scott Gottlieb has tried to achieve or to tackle with the generic for small molecules. So what are your thoughts on biosimilar and how you guys are thinking about playing it?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of important issues there, so let's try to step through each of the elements of your question. First, let me just say that we're investing in biosimilars. We have 10 programs that we're advancing. We have several programs that have been approved already, several that have launched internationally. We have a number of others that are in advanced clinical development, including in phase 3. So we are active in biosimilars. Obviously, the bulk of our focus is on innovation, but we are capitalizing on the years of expertise that we have in biologics manufacturing and in the regulatory science required to get biologic drugs approved. And that's why we committed to biosimilars, and we believe society deserves choice. And when the intellectual property protecting a molecule is no longer binding, we believe that society deserves a choice, and we intend to reliably, safely supply biosimilar products, and very likely at a discount to the innovator products. So I would take issue with those who say that biosimilars aren't working in the U.S. Again, we're amongst the first companies exposed from an innovative standpoint to biosimilars. Our Neupogen molecule was one of the first to find that it was facing biosimilar competition. And the biosimilars now have the bulk of the market for short-acting filgrastim, which is our Neupogen product. I think there are 14 or 18 different biosimilars that have been approved in the U.S. There are still some legal issues that are being worked through, so many of those haven't launched, but they will. And I think that the result of that will be that biologics will be available at a discount in the marketplace to patients, payers, physicians who want to use them. I think it's important that the regulatory bar be high. I think it's important that safety and reliability be met for these patients. Otherwise, I think we really do run the risk of derailing what has the potential to be an important way to free up resources in our healthcare system. But to declare that it hasn't been a success, I think is premature. Again, we're competing. We expect that this business will be successful. I think the risk is that that policy changes in Washington could conspire to create an environment in biologics like that which we have in generics. So the small molecule generic business in the U.S. is a commodity business. Our patients in this country are able to get generics at amongst the lowest prices in the world. But because of it being a commodity market, there are altogether too many instances where there's a single supplier in the marketplace, and that single supplier is able to charge monopoly rents, and that's the kind of thing we saw with Martin Shkreli. It's the kind of thing we saw with other drugs that got on the front page of the news, and I think we need to avoid that in biosimilars. So we are advocating for a robust, competitive marketplace that doesn't favor one biosimilar over another and doesn't favor biosimilars versus the innovator products. And I think if we go down that route of trying to pick winners, I think we will lose what is otherwise set to be a robust competitive market for biosimilars.
So what are the policy tools that you think Congress or some of the agency might have to in some ways try to prevent what happened in the classic generic market?
Well, we think that the framework that was created with Obamacare creates a framework that was attractive enough for us to invest in and advance 10 molecules in, and many other competitors chose to do the same thing. So we think the framework exists through the BPCIA or Obamacare, and we think changes to that risk disrupting what started off, I think, as a potentially robust competitive marketplace. So, incentives that try to get people to move straight to or provide doctors and hospitals a bigger incentive to use the cheaper biosimilar and do it for a window in time, for example, will expose the system to gaming in a way that I don't think anybody intends. And the long-run consequence of that will be manufacturers exit the market, and we'll end up with something like the generics. And we will find that there'll be one or two suppliers for biosimilar molecules, and those one or two remaining suppliers will extract monopoly rents. And I don't think that'll be a pretty picture as compared to a world where you have 4, 5, 6 biosimilar competitors, each competing for some chunk of the market.
So it's a discussion about biosimilar, and the worthy goal of getting to a functioning marketplace is really a good reminder of the fact that, as we talk about this ever covered and pricing issue in our business, it seems that all of us, or at least many people, maybe not us, but a lot of people outside, forget that there was a bargain that was struck with HatchWaxman. Mm-hmm. And that industry was about, we're going to invest in innovation, we're going to obtain intellectual property, and we'll be able to price according to free market for a period of X years. Average having been 12 years for a lot of the life of this business. And now somehow that whole paradigm or framework seems to be receding, in the background, where there is no recognition of the fact that you bring the innovation, you generate the return to finance those enterprises and to generate more innovation, and then pricing essentially goes to a commodity level. Mm-hmm. And it's a good thing for everybody. It's a good thing for society. Do you think that people are somehow conveniently forgotten or kind of avoided the being reminded or reminding people of HatchWaxman and how that system and this whole concept would seem to be a fair deal for everybody? Because right now it looks like it's just not good enough. I mean, it's almost like we're hearing that, well, you know what? Innovation is too expensive. You should not even have an exclusivity period. And I exaggerate, I'm being facetious, but there is a bit of that feeling when you look at the debate.
Sure. I mean, there's a temptation to think that the fix for the short term is simply to eliminate or to reduce the data exclusivity. So, for example, Obamacare created 12 years of data exclusivity for biologics in the U.S. There are some who say, gosh, maybe that number should be 7. If that number is 7, there'll be a lot less innovative research and development in the industry than there is today. But I think you're right. And I think in an attempt to try to address a short-term problem, people are trying to do things like march-in rights or do things like take away years of data exclusivity, when I think your point is a fair one. I think the bargain has worked pretty well. What would I point to suggest that's true? Well, 90% of the prescriptions in this country are for generic drugs. And the vast majority of those generic drugs are available at commodity prices, including at some of the lowest prices in the world, and certainly in the developed world. The cost of treating cardiovascular disease, for example, today with antihypertensives, statins, and other oral medicines is a small fraction of what it was a decade ago. And that's appropriate. And we will see that happen, I think, with the biologic drugs as well. So I do think, I like that idea of the bargain, and I think the bargain has worked. But again, not everybody in society believes that, so we need to be prepared to stand up with our data and have the discussions.
So it naturally brings us to what I personally think is a very important topic, which is the topic of cures, which is something that probably even 10 years ago we would not even have dreamed of talking about on a panel like that, because it would have been seeming as promotion and dream. But now it's happening, right? You and others are developing some cures, and of course it brings back that core issue, which is, so how do we price cure?
That's right.
To the extent that a disease will actually be eliminated and all the costs that are attached to that disease will be gone, how does one think about pricing, right? I mean, obviously the one case study is Gilead, which was an unfortunate episode, in my opinion, for Gilead, because there is tens of billions of savings that are going to occur every year for the rest of time, thanks to their cure and discovery, and there was a bad guy. And so how do we avoid that? Let's say when you will unavoidably come with your own cures in a number of diseases, what are the lessons that you're taking from all the discussion, in particular the Gilead debacle?
Yeah, I think if you could imagine back to the day when you left clinical practice, 1993 or something around that time, if you had imagined that there might be a cure for what was probably then, non-A, non-B, hepatitis.
Yes.
If somebody told you that there might be a cure for that, you might have wept, right? At the idea that you could prevent the suffering that occurred to people who were exposed chronically to hepatitis C. And the idea that disease was able to be effectively cured and then have it become a poster child for what's wrong with innovation, I think is a tragedy. I think it does raise an important question. How are we as a society going to tackle the question of cure, for example, in cancer? And I remember, when I became CEO in 2012, my colleagues didn't like hearing me use the word cure when talking about cancer. But I'm excited today to report that my colleagues in discovery research use the idea every day, and so we and others are fighting like we've never fought before to try to cure some of these diseases. And it will raise a very important question, which is what's the appropriate price for that cure? And I think we're probably going to be surprised as a community of investors with the answer. I think the experience with hepatitis C points us in the direction that we should be looking, not at the sky. I don't think the sky is the limit. I think we're going to need to learn from the experience of hepatitis C. Now, I happen to think that the pharmacoeconomic data for hepatitis C cure, as I understand the data, were overwhelmingly clear that we as a society in the United States benefited from investing in that cure, benefited from making sure patients who needed the therapy had access to it. And I think the same will be true with cancer. But we have to create a framework that I think we all feel confident in, that we think is transparent, that's fair, that reflects what is the value of innovation, what is the investment value of innovation that provides meaningful improvement in the quality of life, and in some cases, cures and restores to an afflicted individual the prospect of living a healthy, normal life well into their 9th decade, for example. And if we, in the absence of such a framework, it's a very difficult conversation to have. But I think we're moving in the direction of trying to create some frameworks that we can openly, transparently discuss with each other.
So we'll take one question, because I was looking and I just got one interesting question, also obvious, but we just got that question saying, in light of what happened with Gilead, and we all know why there was such a outcry, because no one had budgeted for the increased amazing influx of patients in that particular situation, which is probably unusual because there was all those people that had been stockpiled, so to speak, by a number of clinicians. But what pricing model do you think, and I know it might be a case by case, but might be the most able to palliate with the challenge of really getting a fair deal for both sides.
Well, yeah, and why don't we move off the specific case of hepatitis C and tackle the question more generally? Yeah. I think what the question gets at are two things. One, is there a framework that we in this country can be comfortable with, a framework that might revolve around the notion, for example, of quality-adjusted life years? And if there is a quality-adjusted life year discussion that we can have, what value do we want to ascribe in this country to a quality-adjusted life year? And how do we want to think about that in comparison with, say, the United Kingdom, where they've assigned 30,000 pounds as the appropriate quality-adjusted life year benefit? So I think that's a discussion that we can begin to have. And then I think we can begin to have discussions about alternative payment models. You know, do these curative therapies need to be paid for, you know, all at once, or is there some other way to reward the innovation? And I think we're going to see all kinds of different attempts to create reimbursement other than just a payer having to write a check for the care at the time that it was administered. So yeah, we might find that it's just paid off over time. Yep. We might find insurance products evolving to accommodate this reality. We might even see, you know, a very different life insurance model evolve. Because after all, you know, the moment you have a life insurance policy, you and the entity that underwrote the policy for you are aligned in a desire to see you live a long, healthy life. So, you know, there are some things that I think some financial innovations that may come and help address this challenge.
Yes, there are a lot of logical solutions that do not seem to be on the agenda of a lot of people, right unfortunately, now, but hopefully we'll get there. Yeah. Well, right on time. So join me in thanking Bob.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean-François.